Welcome to Law and Justice. I'm Jane Mulcahy. This is a special series on the topic of how to talk policy and influence people. And today I am joined by Rick Kelly, who's in Canada, and it's 10:30 in the morning there. Thank you, Rick. How are you?
I'm absolutely wonderful.
I believe I've kind of cut into your mid-morning walk, so you'll have to postpone it a bit and chat to me about restorative practices and all that.
Sure.
So thank you for taking the time, Rick.
Love to.
So can you just tell me a little bit about yourself and your background and your professional expertise before we talk about restorative practice more generally?
Sure. And probably before doing that, typically what I like to do is locate myself geographically.
Okay.
So from my perspective, I am an uninvited visitor on the traditional lands of the Anishinaabe peoples. So this is actually stolen land. The Anishinaabe are comprised of three nations: the Ojibwe, the Ottawa, and the Potawatomi, which together comprise the Three Fires Confederacy. So in colonial settler language, I do live in Canada, in a small town called Tottenham in Ontario, which is north of the big metropolis of Toronto. And I think, the land acknowledgement actually is part of a restorative endeavor to engage in truth and reconciliation. So acknowledging the truth of where I live, I think is important. So the question in terms of sort of my background. So I am a child and youth worker who's been in the field for 45 plus years. My first 25 years allowed me to work on both sides of the street, as I like to say, and that's literally and figuratively.
Right.
I was introduced into child and youth work through an advanced diploma, and many of my mentors at that time came from an adolescent psychiatry, mental health, clinical background. So I was quite well steeped in those traditions and the family therapy models that came out of that. But at the same time, I literally did work on the street. So I did street-based child and youth work. And then in the 90s, I ran one of 8 sites that was a policy demonstration site to demonstrate how early investment could promote well-being and prevent poor outcomes for children by, in my case, implementing a school as a hub model in the center of a very high needs community in Toronto, and engaging the community, families, and creating a much more integrated model for well-being. In fact, those children are now 27 and 29, and they're being followed up as we speak right now to see if that type of investment strategy actually works.
Amazing.
Then I went on. Yeah, no, it's a phenomenal. So I think because that's really framed a lot of my work is in terms of prevention from that point of view.
I'm sorry, Rick. How old would those kids have been when you first would have interacted them with this education hub?
They were 4 years of age.
Okay. Okay.
But also my own thinking was that in terms of early intervention, you need to walk it back. So we implemented a whole host of programs for preschoolers 0 to 4 and had a family resource center and a toy library. And also we brought in prenatal nutrition programs for women in the area who were more at risk for low birth weight. So to me, that's part of the whole continuum, and it shouldn't stop there. It's my other bugaboo. It needs to go on through all those sort of developmental stages and that.
Yeah. Wow, that's so interesting. And you did that as a youth worker?
Yes. Yes,
okay.
I was the manager for the program, and yeah, and brought that sort of decidedly distinctive approach to education, which was a well-grounded child development and also mental health approach. So I think it was a great addition to an educational institution.
And were they very receptive to this new way of thinking and working, or was there a bit of persuasion that had to go into it?
It took 18 months to get this off the ground. We happened to be in a school where a number of the teachers didn't want to be there. They had selected elsewhere, ended up
Okay.
there. But the principal was a champion. And so I could work with her, and she really engaged the parents. And there was some key teachers who were champions.
Mm-hmm.
I could spot them in the lunchroom because in the morning they were playing Balderdash
Okay.
and laughing their heads off. And they invited me to join. And I said,
Okay.
this is my kind of people. And they
Yeah.
did become the true champions. So that together, it was like a rolling stone. It just gathered momentum. And the more we demonstrated and approached the teachers like partners and
Sure.
nurtured them and supported them, the more and more we engaged the majority.
What a phenomenal project, simply as well, because it was very forward thinking for the time. I mean, we're talking about doing those type of projects now, but I guess what this shows is they've always been good ideas. They've always been innovators.
Yeah.
And you don't necessarily have to reinvent the wheel. You just have to go looking for the evidence.
Yeah.
And so you mentioned there that there's actually an ongoing study of those
Yes.
kids who are now adults.
Yes.
Fantastic.
Yeah, they followed them at various points in what we would call grade 9, grade 12, and now in their sort of, later or early adult years in that. So there's been these various points along the way, and it's quite a substantial research project because I think it meets the rigor of scientific because it has random controlled sites to compare to, and also there's extensive narrative descriptions from children, parents, residents, and other professional stakeholders. And it's back to what you say, we don't have to reinvent the wheel, but unfortunately we always do. And one of the books that I found during that time was a book by Elizabeth Shore called Common Knowledge, and another one, Within Our Reach. And what she talks about is we know what to do. There are these examples everywhere, but we constantly pilot them and then let them go. In this case, this one wasn't let go. And in fact, it was supposed to be a 4-year time frame, and then it was over. But because we're so well organized amongst the 8 communities around the province, and we made such a hue and cry, both in terms of letters, but also we workshopped the government, we had parent spokespersons. They saw that they couldn't I think bring this to an end. And this was during a conservative regime as well, who was very cost-cutting. So it was quite significant that we were able to have sort of a second life that wasn't anticipated. And those projects are still running to this day.
Amazing. And so then, just in terms of the research angle of it, do they reveal the identity of this school, or like, obviously they keep the kids secret?
No, they do. In fact, I have a book that's specifically written about that school. It's the Highfield School. So a single volume was written by the researchers about their experience there, because researchers were assigned to various sites where they were able to. And so we had a group, and what was good is they were community psychologists. So they were in the renegade sort of version of psychology, but very much in line with a community-based approach in that. No, it was revealed where the sites were and their locations.
Fascinating. So I know you from Twitter, Rick.
Yes.
I've met so many interesting people over the last couple of years. I was very slow to join, reluctant to join, and I'm really glad I eventually did. And so I know that you do work now in restorative practice and training and circles and that kind of thing. For those who do not know what restorative practice is, can you tell me what is it and what are its core elements?
Right. So I distinguish between the kind of the 2 frames that are used. One is restorative justice, and that appeared in modern times probably in the late 80s and through the book Changing Lenses by Howard Zayers at the Eastern Mennonite University. And his book was called Changing Lenses. So what he was saying that in terms of justice, we need to look at justice from a very different point of view, that if we use laws and the structures around laws, and we define individuals in that way, what you have is an adversarial approach that seeks for guilt, looks for what type of punishment, and silences the voices of everybody involved. So it's, essentially unsatisfactory to everybody. From a restorative justice point of view, though, the perspective is very different. It defines these events that cause harm as events that are doing damage to relationships.
Mm-hmm.
Therefore, the idea around restorative is how do we restore the individuals involved, the person that caused the harm, and the person who was harmed, and the relationships that have been affected, because this tends to ripple out.
Mm-hmm.
And you do that by having encounters. And those encounters are either in circle format or in conferences, typically in the restorative justice sort of world. Restorative practices for me is the broader, all-encompassing sort of framework and foundation. For me, it's a practice model that's relationally focused, that builds community and relationships. And if you're going to and need to deal with conflicts and harms, the most effective way to be able to do that is in a context where there are relationships.
Mm-hmm.
So that's where I always lean towards the more restorative practice model, because for me, it's foundational to all of our human service work, and also just our daily encounters. I do a lot of work with parents around restorative parenting because
Right.
it's about relationships and attachment. The other thing to also then widen it out is that it also has deep roots and similarities to indigenous ways of thinking.
Yeah, I
And
was just about to
Afrocentric
ask.
ways. Yeah. So from an indigenous point of view, you can look at various phrases, like in Lakota, they say that we are all relatives.
Right.
In Cree and Michif, they say that we're all connected. And not only are we connected, but we're connected to all the species in the world, and also Mother Earth, the environment, and that in that connectedness, we have a responsibility to be good stewards and to ensure that we are in right relationship with all those different component elements in that. From an Afrocentric point of view, the term that I think many people have heard is Ubuntu.
Mm-hmm.
And Ubuntu, means in various ways, I am because of you. Your pain is my pain. Your wealth is my wealth. Your salvation is my salvation. So those things, I think that we can learn from and guide our own work in terms of building community. And it very much, I think is very consistent with a modern view of community work and organizational work and how you run teams and that, which is, the more we work together in a good way, then the better off we all will be. And that if there are difficulties and harms, then that's the place where we need restorative justice. So it's constantly, for me, going back and forth, which is building relationships, and then where we need to stepping back, having difficult conversations with an eye to how do we repair and restore, the individuals involved in that.
Yeah, it's so interesting because I would have come across restorative justice when I was studying criminal law, obviously, and talking about the indigenous underpinnings in many ways. And it is so interesting then that, in Canada, when you referred to the lands that you're on, I was at the ICPA conference in Montreal a couple of years ago, and every time someone from the non-Indigenous population got up, there was this truth telling and honoring, I guess, of the fact that they are stolen lands.
Right, exactly.
Is that always done, Rick? And is it important, or is it going through the motions for, say, some of the politicians, that it's just something that needs to be said? Or does it, like for a long time, I guess it wasn't said, and then all of a sudden a decision was made, this needs to be done?
Yeah. I think it happens more and more, and certainly in schools and post-secondary and community organizations. But what I use to reflect on that is professor from Ryerson, Hayden King. He's First Nations, and he crafted their land acknowledgement for Ryerson University. And he wrote a piece saying, you know, actually, I kind of regret having done this. And I regret having done that because for many people, it's end of story. They
Right.
do that, and they don't do it with meaning or depth or understanding,
Hmm.
which in part is easy to see because our history that's taught does not teach the history of the genocide of the First Nations peoples and that. So when I do a land acknowledgement, if I were to do one, I also use some pictures from a First Nations artist here, Kent Monkman, who's restoried the origin stories of Canada through an Indigenous lens and actually brings in the horrors that many communities, nations were subjected to, you know, oftentimes including the taking away of their children.
Yeah.
So for me, I think that it, you know, it has to be done with sincerity and with depth, and only done with an appreciation that this is only one piece. It is speaking truth, but reconciliation or anything restorative is really about, you know, what are the reparative actions that need to be undertaken.
Yeah.
And some of them, you know, are quite considerable because we're talking about historical traumas. And it also relates to Black persons in Canada as
Sure.
well. So there's
Sure.
a parallel narrative there that needs to be understood and integrated into any type of restorative work that any practitioner is doing now. That's why whenever I talk about it, I talk about next generation restorative practices.
Yes.
The first generation in sort of modern form really did come out of justice. And so the trouble with that is that oftentimes it inherits the trappings, the language, and the frames that are used in a criminal justice framework that tries to be an alternative, but it's an alternative within something that's already constructed.
Mm-hmm. I interviewed a woman called Dr. Eben Joseph, who's an Afro Nigerian woman living in Ireland and a
Mhm.
wonderful academic.
Mhm.
But one of the things that she was saying
Yeah,
is that we need to incorporate positive stories of Africa in our curriculums, you
right.
know, and I guess it's the same in a way in Canada. It's telling the truth about the woundings and the
Yes,
atrocities, but
yes,
also speaking about the positives. And you mentioned the great connection with the land
yeah,
and the great connection with one another as humans. That's
yeah,
something we've lost, I think,
yes,
in mainstream society, you know, in the dominant white
yeah,
male orthodoxy and stuff. We're quite disconnected. It's
yeah.
very individualistic. Um, is that part of the work that you guys might do in the education setting, you know, work around that, or changing the narratives maybe about particular groups that might be problematized at times?
Without a doubt, like in my context, in my work, my guiding sort of principle right now is that I need to always work with other voices that typically have been silenced in that.
Hmm.
Um, Also, I think, as you said, in terms of positive stories, I think we need to appreciate and learn from traditional ways of knowing, being, and caring for others. So there's a wealth of riches in Indigenous ways of knowing and um, Afrocentric ways of being, as well as others in that,
Hmm.
because as you said, we have sort of a hegemonic view of what knowledge is, and it frames it in a particular way that excludes other ways of knowing. So without a doubt, and you know, and just at a simple level, there are so many examples of resilience. There's so many artists now on you know, from both, you know, Indigenous and Afrocentric perspectives that are, really showing the infinite creativity and ability to imagine other worlds, that I think that, anybody who was educating could just dip into that as a way of profiling the strengths and gifts that other people have to offer. So, and that's to me, that to me is very restorative, because it's about circles. So the
Yes.
thing is, we need to widen the circle and ensure that, all voices are given time and that we listen to what they have to say. So I think it has to do with community.
Yes.
It has to do with, sort of education. I mean, I think a case in point, as you mentioned about, where Twitter has taken you. I mean, where it's taken me is I've really developed acute insight into the experiences of the travelers,
Yeah, right.
and have, followed a number of the thinkers, writers, artists, advocates. And I think that's another sort of case in point. So I think all countries have, similar dilemmas.
Yeah, indeed. I mean, they're a very good example in our own
Yeah.
context of historical trauma and ongoing oppression, really, because
Mhm.
their way of life has been criminalized by the state,
Yeah.
And unlike, say, the acknowledgement of theft of indigenous land, we've never had a state apology, And
Mm.
I made a personal one, just saying at an event once that I'm sorry that you have had these outcomes because
Mhm.
of deliberate state policies.
Mhm.
But what is needed is something from our politicians as a
Yeah.
first step. Like you say, it's not an end goal by any means, but there is something a little bit healing about the words "I'm sorry" when they're meant, especially,
Right. Yeah.
um, for sure. But another thing I was thinking about uh, when I was thinking about the ICPA was there was a wonderful woman called Elder Melissa who used to do work in prisons
Hmm. Hmm.
with women
Yeah.
and men who are incarcerated, and she had such a beautiful way of telling
Hmm.
stories.
Hmm.
And I personally find Indigenous storytelling fascinating. It
Yes.
really gets me in the gut.
Yeah. Yeah.
And in fact, one of the prisoners in Ireland, well, he was still a prisoner, but he was out in the community teaching a course, and he used the Cherokee legend of the two wolves
Hmm.
to kind of
Hmm.
tell the group
Yeah.
about feeding the wolf of
Yeah.
hope. So they
Yeah.
have transnational relevance, really, in
Yeah.
speaking to the human condition.
Right. And
Um,
well, I think the thing that also goes with that is, again, putting it into the context of restorative work. I think much of it is narrative and storytelling based. And
mhm,
so when I've, worked with youth in the justice system, or also educating youth workers, the way I frame it is, this is an opportunity to sort of, support young people to re-narrate their pathway. They've, have a story that got them here, and how aware they are of all the dynamics, but that's their narrative. And sometimes they're just simply living it out.
mm,
But in restoring, then, what we do is empower them
mm.
to tell a story differently.
Yes.
And that, and that time, at times was viscerally demonstrated when I worked with one organization that, facilitated conferences that came out of court and had those conversations, but then had different types of life skills programs that they went into, that, gave them different types of skills. So
Mhm.
unconnected to specifically what they'd done, they could, join the School of Rock, or the Power
Yeah.
of One was, video storyboarding and creating a PSA, or they could do urban tree planting or go into magic. But all of them was really about, giving them a different sense of themselves and their competencies, but
Yes.
also giving them a different narrative about themselves.
Mhm.
And so I think that's where, to me, there's a universal element. And I think being Irish, I think you'd be fairly akin to storytelling, because
Oh
that's where
yeah.
my grandparents come from. So
Yeah.
stories were, you know, part of everything, whether they were true or not. Although, as my grandfather said, I can't lie. I just tell stories, you know.
Yeah.
So really,
No,
was there a bear in the backyard? I don't know.
it's so true. The importance of telling new stories about oneself,
Yeah,
or understanding that the dominant
yeah.
narrative, let's say, has been very incomplete, to say the least, particularly in the criminal justice system. I
Hmm.
mean,
Hmm.
as you mentioned, the mainstream justice system doesn't allow either the offender or the
Yeah.
victim to really speak. It's the lawyers
Yes.
and their version of what has happened, and obviously police and other experts, but
Yeah.
the people are sidelined.
Exactly.
And so to just go back to restorative practice again, it strikes me that the emphasis on narrative and voice in
Hmm.
general, and also on relational repair, has quite a lot in common
Hmm.
with trauma-informed approaches. Would you agree, Rick?
Without a doubt. And I think that anyone who is a restorative practitioner needs to be trauma informed. So they need to understand, you know, the presence and the particular impacts of trauma and the neurodevelopmental dynamics, and also how do we work our way through that, and especially if we're talking about intergenerational and historical traumas. And so, you know, one of the dilemmas I think in our world and language-based culture is we tend to, you know, ask people, talk to me about that, but that's not where you need to begin when you're addressing trauma.
Mm-hmm.
You need to actually, I think, name the trauma to begin with, but then, you know, first of all, work to reclaim like the body, the
Mm.
senses, the emotions, and ground people first in their body and their sensorium, and then begin sort of a reparative, restorative journey. So I think a lot of times some of the trauma work, well intentioned, is misplaced. And I think there's enough that we know through like Bruce Perry's work and Bessel van der Kolk and Stephen Porges that, you know, that we really need to work on reclaiming the body first before we can move into, you know, higher order processes, whether it's, you know, cognitive processing or simply talking about things. Because otherwise what we do is we re-traumatize people. So for me, the restorative reach needs to encompass a trauma-informed lens, and then engage in a journey through that.
That's a really, really interesting and important point, because I think a lot of the time people think, okay, you need to tell your trauma narrative. Let's say you need to get into the details.
Yeah.
Let's say as a victim, tell the young person what it meant to you or how it was and what you're feeling now, which can be extremely activating. And the
Yes.
person might be re-experiencing it,
Yes.
which undermines then the healing potential possibly of the encounter. So would that have been something that you would have worked on for a long time, or is that a newer thing to come into your awareness, the fact that trauma is held in the body, and to feel safe, really, because that's what's ruptured essentially
Yeah.
with trauma, is not feeling safe in your body around other
Yeah.
people.
Right.
And like, might you have seen it in circle settings, maybe, where someone does get activated by talking about something and then maybe they can't continue?
Yeah. So a couple things. There's a few sort of
There's a, yes,
points in there.
sorry,
Yeah,
I do that
that's okay.
sometimes.
That's
Stream of
okay.
consciousness.
No, that's right. My partner often asks three-part questions,
Yeah.
so I have to write down what they are. No, so the first one is sort of like becoming aware of it. So that was a question that I asked myself and one of my teaching partners. So I went back to one of the books that we used, which is called "Troubled Children and Youth Turning Crisis into Opportunity," and that was published in 2004. So it's by the Reclaiming Youth folks, and then there was a subsequent subsequent book called Deep Brain Learning.
Mm-hmm.
And then I was looking at Bruce Perry's book, which I brought into the program as well. The Boy Was Raised as a Dog, and that was written in 2006. So I think that, back then I was aware, but I think with the new work that's been done, I think we have a better understanding and more finely tuned understanding of sort of the neurodevelopmental processes and how it links to the body. So that's grown and emerged. And so your point about people being triggered, exactly. And I think that you can't always know how someone will respond, but I think some of the assurances that you're moving in the right direction is one, obviously being trauma informed, but also in work with individuals, it's working from a consent-based point of view.
Mm-hmm.
So you're asking them, and part of that's preparation work is, what do you need? What do you want? What does it look like? And then, conjuring up, okay, so if you were to be in a group with someone like this, what would your thoughts be about how that would impact on you? And I think what we know is that, from, the documented, instances, is that it often takes some time before people can come into a conversation with people, and sometimes can look like a number of years. So, and I think we need to underline that, because in the world that we live in one that's so oftentimes, programmatically focused, the luxury of time is not offered, which I think is actually a travesty, because relationships don't come with time frames. They have a dynamic of their own, and they have to go through stages. And that's why I think relational work is also a special type of work that also is not well articulated or understood by the general population, and people that have sort of power to fund programs. So I think from different points of view, we need to be able to, one, give consent, but also appreciate these things take time.
Yeah.
These things
And
take
sometimes I presume it might be the prudent thing to do to say, I think we need to take a break now, or I did an interview a while back with Dr. Bob Schwartz, who does tapping and a lot of energy psychology. And I found it fascinating, because this is something that any of us can learn, to regulate our bodies and kind of distract ourselves or that type of thing. And Bessel van der Kolk has demonstrated it as well, that various again, bringing us out of our I guess the back of our brain and back into our body, regulating the body can help people modulate their arousal.
Well, in many regards, we're as a culture, I think we're somewhat disembodied. And it was back to talking about sort of our connection to nature. We're also becoming sort of denatured in a way.
Very much.
I don't know what it's like in Ireland, but I can reflect on sort of my childhood, where parents said, bye, see you at dinner time, and it was fine. What actually has been documented, and what I know from working in different communities where children don't go outside, and then as I watch this generation now, and there's lots of reasons why parents don't let kids go outside, particularly if it's unsafe, and it's neighborhoods that we've constructed in a way to the modern sort of world where we're surrounded by screens and gadgets. And I see that happening. And as I say, does anybody go camping anymore?
Yeah, well, some people do for sure, but my kids are some of the only ones in their class. They're only 7 and 8 who don't have their own devices.
Right.
I mean, they're almost seen as antiquities because they don't know about Fortnite and this, that, and the other. But what parents don't realize is if their children are on gadgets all day, they're getting more attached to their devices than to actual humans a lot of the time, which is going to have different problems for future generations than the ones that that we have right now. And yet they're a great tool. So it's kind of moderating their usage and everything like that. To just go back to the issue of cultural trauma and race, do you see, and racism, do you see restorative practice as having a key role to play, just in a general way, whether it's in schools, whether it's in communities, to try and build some bridges between groups of people really who might be quite suspicious of one another or wary, for sometimes for good reason, perhaps because of the way the community has functioned or malfunctioned. But do you think that, let's say, communities who are trying to build a healthier environment and a more connected environment for kids going forward, that restorative practice has something valuable to offer?
If the community leads it. I think that becomes the dilemma. Speaking from my context, you know, in Ontario, I think many communities and families see the school as actually the source of harm. So in terms of being able to be a bridge, it's how the bridge gets built. And as I always say, is go to the community and they will be there. Their voices will be there, and you need to listen and build from there. My experience, having worked extensively with schools and school boards, is that that's an incredible challenge for schools and school boards. They have real difficulty knowing how to engage. Part of that is because they're not community developers. They also typically don't live in the communities that they're providing education for. So they may have no idea of what it's like to live in those communities and that. And also they use like an educational paradigm, which I think again is somewhat sort of decontextualized in that. So I think it is, but it depends on how it's built and who leads it. I just know from one of my first research projects working with kids under 12, we were going to work with different school boards, and I had a great trustee, quite an activist, and I went to her and I said, I have this, you know, opportunity. What do you think? She says, well, it could work so long as we don't do this work on school sites. We need to have neutral sites where this can happen.
Wow, because because the schools themselves are kind of traumatizing for the community.
Exactly. And if you look at, certainly research here has shown that there's an incredible disparity and equity in terms of school discipline as it relates to Black students and also others, but particularly Black students. So when you have that sort of gross inequity and injustice, and then to bring in restorative justice, it you know, is not the solution, and gets this then to be seen, and probably is part of the problem, because it's not getting to the root. And that's where, to me, it's again about a restorative practice model. Where are we building that relationship first before we tackle the hard issues?
Yeah. And I guess also, if the school is a site of harm, it's the building itself is a contaminated space. And also the relationships, the power dynamic there that won't just go away, you know, and the shaming, blaming attitudes maybe of teaching staff. So then it would have to be led by members of the community itself.
Yeah, I mean, and in partnership with, you know, there's often champions within the school. There are, you know, teachers who are well tuned to the community and may very well be part of the community, and other, you know, educational workers. Like here we have, you know, significant numbers of youth workers, and they're often considered to be bridge builders because they typically are from those communities or communities very similar. So they can speak the language, because part of that is, you know, understanding how people see it through their own eyes and the particular language they use, so they don't have to sort of code switch and all of a sudden adopt a different language.
Yeah, I hear you. It's certainly worth thinking about for anyone who wants to lead change in this area or be part of change, to think through the various ramifications of decisions, and maybe not to rush into things either, because that can be an impulse sometimes that, you know, we need to do something now, it's so urgent, and botching it then can be a challenge.
Well, and a case in point, I go back to that one project I was talking about, the school as a hub model. So the framework around steering and decision making was that 51% of the steering committee and all other committees, and we had 3 for community, family, and school, had to have 51 representation of parents and residents. So we flipped the power dynamic, and that was for all projects. And I remember when I had to announce to the steering committee when we first started is a whole bunch of you people have to leave. I said it more nicely than that.
I love it, Rick. That's brilliant.
But you know, I said, you know, you've had your day. This is where we're going, and we need to change things around. And you know, we got there. But again, it was about building community and doing things right. And that whole process took like 18 months.
And the doing with, not to or for aspect. I mean, really, it was very visionary to be that kind of, I suppose, decentering the services, to use Cormac Russell's phrase from Rekindling Democracy, which you kindly pointed me to, but trying to get individuals and parents and residents who are the experts in their own lives and their needs, you know, what will actually help, to sideline the services a little bit, you know, to make space at the table.
Exactly. And, you know, and once again, that takes time because, you know, if you ask any person in general about their experiences with education, if you ask an adult, most people don't have good experiences. Some do, you know, so you've got that sort of baggage where you have to engage in conversations about, you know, not only, you know, the past and those harms, but actually how do we repair the future?
Yes.
And so that's a great thing, you know, the one project or working with children is you can always say, okay, so those things happen to you. How can we do this differently so that we have different futures for our kids, because they are actually the future. It's not only just like a saying, but it is actually a reality, because as I say, one day my kids are going to be looking after me and we'll see what happens.
Sure.
I'm not going to be cooperative.
Oh yeah, you're planning that already. The
Oh yeah, well they're planning it too, where I'm going to live in the basement.
Okay. Well, you've all mapped out. It sounds good. And so, Rick, for people who really know little about restorative practice, but might have tuned into this now, and they're thinking, "Oh, this is quite intriguing. Maybe we should do something along these lines." What would you urge them to consider, or what few bits of advice would you give them in approaching a new initiative?
Approaching a new initiative. So one would be open to the possibility. The other thing would be to listen in a sincere and engaged way, work to understand, don't react. And that there are a whole series of little books on restorative justice and restorative practices and circles. So they're incredibly accessible, very readable, they're cheap, you can get them as a Kindle. You just sort of Google little books on restorative justice and you'll get a whole. So there are, you know, lots to guide us. And I think, you know, the simplest thing is, I think we all want to be in a good way with ourselves and with each other. And that there are ways of doing that that allow us to be the best that we possibly can for ourselves and others. So that I would, you know, operate from a hopeful perspective, that there are ways of working through difficult situations and harms, and that there's lots of examples. And it doesn't, you know, necessarily require an expert, because I think we all can go on our inner wisdom if we give ourselves the time to engage with our second thoughts, not our first thoughts. They tend to be reactive, and maybe not our best, and that's where we have regrets. So give ourselves time to sort of reflect on just what's going on, what do I need, what's happening, and then engage with other people in a way that, we're open and we listen to what they have to say.
Yeah. As you say that there, it makes me think really restorative practice should be a key part of kind of workplace relations as well, because
Yeah.
we often don't listen to one another.
No.
We can be quite quick to be offended and to take things poorly, which of course can partly stem from our own trauma or attachment experiences and inability to take criticism or whatever else. So that managers would do well to have some of these skills in their toolbox.
Without a doubt, and there is a whole strain and set of work around restorative management practices and also teamwork, and that's a lot of the work that I do is engaging teams and managers around how to have different conversations, how to be more transparent, more open, how to still have high expectations, but always to maintain the self-esteem and relationships around you while focusing on what needs to be done and sort of performance. Just a little anecdote, I did a session with a group of university professors and I conducted like a circle exercise, where you do it in a very sort of measured way, it's guided by values and a talking piece and what have you. And everybody gets to talk and everybody gets to listen. As one person said to me, she says, "Oh, we never talk like that." She says, "We're always interrupting, we're always debating." I said, "Yeah." So I said, "Which one do you think has more benefits? And how do you feel after, one versus the other?" And so it's allowing people, again, to reflect on experience. That's where, the proof is in that those sort of very visceral, real experiences. But it has a place everywhere, because wherever we are, we're in relationship with each other, whether in our personal lives or in our professional and organizational lives.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, indeed. So I keep going back to community because, well, it's a strand of my current work, thinking about how do we promote collective efficacy. And I've also become really fascinated by the idea of how can we build trauma-informed communities. So part of that is bringing awareness to them, obviously, about trauma and how it manifests and attachment and cultural harms and all of this. But have you any ideas about what we can do to help the wider community? Now, this is no community in particular, but the wider community, wherever we live. If we live in a deprived community, it might be even more urgent. But how can we foster that Ubuntu and that human connectedness?
Well, I think a lot of times it has to do with very local efforts. It's kind of like the idea of let 1,000 flowers bloom, and I think it's, igniting and highlighting. And that's, what I look to is examples of where communities come together in very spontaneous ways and ongoing ways, and often in the context of, deprivation and hardship. And so it shows that, the events around you, while problematic, don't necessarily need to define you. And it's the same sort of thing, I think, with trauma as well. I think, one of the issues around sort of, sometimes being trauma informed and focusing on ACEs and childhood adversity is that it becomes, definitions. I think that's just, more information to help you understand and guide your way through in that, rather than saying, this is a script. This is the way, things will fall out from there. So I think, looking at, and so I think, it's a combination thing. I think it's always a matter of profiling what people are doing and their resilience and communities come together. I think knowledge is power. And the more that we talk about it, the more that we work towards integrating who we are as persons, that we're a composite of, the mind, emotions, social and spiritual and physical, and that these things are interrelated, and stop, functioning as we kind of compartmentalize and silos those things, and engaging communities that want to design different futures for themselves. And I think oftentimes using children as a central point becomes a bit of a rallying focus.
Yes.
And depending on who you're talking to, sometimes it's important to bring in sort of, the cost benefit analysis.
Yeah.
That the more that, we invest in communities, well, it doesn't show immediate returns. That's why you put money away. So let's use a banking model, which, sometimes we throw out the window when we're talking about these sort of initiatives. But I think a cost benefit analysis will show that, early investments over time typically yield exponential benefits from a cost point of view.
Yes.
And then let's just be humanistic.
Yeah.
It gives people lives and opportunities that, they may otherwise be deprived of because of different barriers of all sorts.
Yeah, it's true. It's hard not to get behind supporting better outcomes for children. We might write off some of the problematic adults, depending on our way of thinking, but it is much more difficult not to kind of want better for little tiny vulnerable people.
And
Rebecca,
I think this snapshot to use too is that all adults were children and infants at one
yes,
point in time.
of course.
So where do we lose our humanity for the big people if only we realize that's where we all started? And a person didn't start out, with issues. That
Indeed.
evolves over time. So if we can live in a world that allows that to happen, that's also a function of design.
Yeah.
So if that can happen, it also can unhappen, and we can design something very different.
So true. I showed the former Minister for State in the Department of Justice and Equality, David Stanton, my daughter's foot. There was a cast of her foot from when she was 1 week old, just to make that point that the boys and men who end up, in gangs or doing bad things, frightening grannies and assaulting people, they were that tiny once, and that vulnerable. And we tend to forget that, and we don't see the importance of the early years when a man is 45 and has been in prison for 20 years. So,
exactly.
And Rebecca Lewis-Pankratz said to me recently that when she presents information about ACEs to parents, they typically say, well, what about our kids? Because they are motivated to do better for their kids, and there's very few parents who aren't. So it is a logical way to start, for sure.
And then they can rewrite the narrative for their own children. And as a result, they rewrite it for themselves, because then they get positioned differently as parents.
That's right. And they succeed at something, or they at least interrupt the harm, and they can make amends. And this is another thing that came up recently. I think it was on Twitter, that someone was saying about their daughter, and knowing their mom loves them because she apologizes if she hurts her feelings. And again, it's vaguely, I think, allied to restorative practice, in the sense that we all mess up. We all do harmful things. As parents, we do it. And part of the whole attachment business is rupture and repair.
Exactly.
And that's what builds resilience. Is it maybe part of the fact that we have, certain child rearing practices, or some people grew up in homes where there were never apologies, that we have this difficulty in accepting responsibility and feeling guilt, I guess.
Yeah, well, when I work with parents, I use, there's what's called a sort of a window on relationships. And you talked about it from a power point of view. It's, using power over, doing for, not doing it all, or engaging with, which is restorative. So what I do with parents, I say, take this window, the 4 prepositions, to, for, not, and with, think about how you were parented and what was the impact on your sense of self, your relationship, and your ability to make changes. And that just leads to all sorts of conversations because they start to look, back into their own past and that. And then I say, so, and what of this now are guiding narratives for your own parenting? And it surfaces different types of conversations where, well, no one, my parents, they always said, do what I say, not what I do.
Mm,
So there was never any apologies.
mm,
So that's not a language that they've been exposed to.
mm,
And I often say that also when it comes to youth as well. If they've not been engaged in a caring relationship where people are with them and sharing power, when you come to them with that orientation, that may have no meaning whatsoever in their life.
mm,
If they've only been done to and neglected, then someone caring for them is like a stranger from a strange land in another planet and that. So I think it's the same sort of thing for parents.
mm,
That's why I love working with parents, because it starts to open the door again to,
mm,
okay, that did happen. I know it's in there. I don't necessarily want to be like that. So
mm.
what's the other way? And there are other ways.
Yeah.
There is a different language that we can use and practices
Mm,
that are not punitive,
mm,
that accept, that everybody makes mistakes. It's kind of like a growth mindset,
mm,
that, the struggle is important.
mm,
Learning, how to deal with frustrations and setbacks are really important because
mm.
that's also part of life.
And I think, again, it's so important in the workplace because, again, errors do get made there. And sometimes the stakes can be
Yeah,
high and people
yeah,
can feel really, it
yeah,
can be a big error.
yeah,
Or just in terms of, in probation practice,
yeah,
um, they harp on about the importance of pro-social modeling.
yeah,
And yet professionals don't always practice what they preach in terms of
mhm,
displaying empathy, maybe,
yeah,
or
mhm,
even understanding why someone has turned up late or hasn't turned up at all, because the timekeeping part of their brain doesn't know what week it is, let
yeah,
alone,
yeah,
that what day of the week. Um, so the ability, I think, though, to model that it's, I made a mistake that
yeah,
time. I was abrupt. I was
yeah,
maybe a bit aggressive,
yeah,
or I
yeah,
had stuff going on. That
yeah.
that is a repair function that I don't think professionals use enough, maybe with the people that they're serving. Or perhaps I'm wrong. Would you agree,
Well,
Rick,
well,
that
no, I would agree that that in the main, I think that's very hard for people to do, and I think it's a function of organizational structures that we have adopted and inherited that are more command and control, and also it's on the human side is the ability to be vulnerable.
mm,
Um, when you're given a position of, management and authority, the unspoken is sort of, well, the buck stops here. You have to be right. You should know everything. You're the expert. But that, defies just basic humanity, which is none of those are possible. You might
mm,
be given responsibility, but that doesn't mean that, you can do it all your own. And also from an advanced management point of view, what we know is the way actually to lead is to lead with and to lead from behind and
mm,
to empower the people you work with. Your best resource are the people you work with in the teams, because you as a manager can't always be there.
yeah,
So you can use a rigid authoritarian, somewhat fear-based approach and allow for no errors, or look at it more as from a developmental point of view. And what I always think of is you have to move from novice to expert. And
yeah,
that's typically a very staged model again. So this is where we forget our developmental theory when it comes to our work lives, and
hmm,
we also forget sometimes our humanity.
yeah,
So I used to do management training, and that was one of the interesting elements, was to focus on the relational dimension and how to manage performance
mm,
in a way that wasn't managing performance, but was coaching and
yeah,
using feedback that really was enhancing what people were doing, while also looking at, things that happened that were errors. As I always say, is make the problem, not the person.
Yeah.
So when we can make that distinction, then you've got room for conversation. But when we conflate them and the
Mm.
person is the problem, then naturally they're going to get defensive. It's just a fundamental response. So we need to, again, open space for conversations and put the problem over there outside of us, and we'll talk about that. And together we will figure it out.
Mm. Yeah, I mean, you do such important heart-centered work, that also makes great sense in the world. The thing about law, I suppose, and humankind in general, is that we think we're so much the front part of our brain. We're
Yeah.
rational, we're reasonable, and even the reasonable man test in the law, in terms of intention and all of that, and whether the behavior is normal or whether it meets
Right.
the criteria for some kind of abnormality. But really, they're based on very outdated, from a scientific point of
Yeah.
view, they don't match the reality at all. And they also don't reckon with our deep emotionality, and that we're often hijacked by emotions. There's no thinking whatsoever going on.
Well, exactly. I mean, two of the questions that I love in restorative conversations with people who have done something that has harmed others, the first one is, what were you thinking at the time? And particularly working with youth, they'll say, well, I wasn't. And that's why the second question, and I've used it at home with my boys, is, now what are you thinking? And so I used it with my second oldest boy, who at a young age was pretty adventurous, risk taking, and maybe out of control. So after he jumped from, I think, the seventh stair and broke his foot, I said, so what were you thinking at the time? He said, I thought I could do one more stair. I said, but you broke your foot on the seventh. So it's back to what you're saying, our thinking processes are sometimes skewed when it comes to how they link with emotions and our actions. And that's where you need a second set of questions is, so now what are you thinking?
Yeah.
When you look backwards on it, what are you thinking? And then the emotions come in terms of restorative conversations when you start to talk about the impacts on other people, and then those people who've been harmed reveal what those impacts are and what it is that they need. And so that's where the law, as you talk about how it doesn't fit with science, it also doesn't fit with, if you're wanting to prevent harms from happening, punishment is not the way. That it also doesn't fit.
Yeah.
But what will work is, a visceral understanding of how you've affected others, particularly, I know, for young people, but others, because they're not aware. They can't see it. It's not within their horizon when they're acting. And when all of a sudden they see that, they go, oh my God, that wasn't what I intended. That wasn't what I meant. I didn't, when I set the cafeteria on fire, I didn't mean this. It was just like, it was fun. It was a lark.
But also, I imagine a visceral feeling of mattering, or a visceral feeling of having someone connect to them enough, and being cared for, maybe, if they've not had that before, and it can be from a caring professional. It could even perhaps be by a victim who all of a sudden understands that they weren't just a baddie, there was stuff going on.
Yeah, well, this is it, and it, what it does is it humanizes events, and when they're put up against a canvas of labels and stereotypes, there is no humanity. It's like the headlines. But when you sit down with a person, and what I've seen, in particular with parents who are on either side, and naturally concerned for their own child and protective, there's a point at which they see their own common humanity, which is they're both parents. They both, you know, want the best for their child, and so they share something in common. And I think that's the what kind of squares the circle, is when we can see our humanity in each other. And just, you know, in kid and youth language, they'll say it differently. They wouldn't say it like that. But
Yeah,
yeah,
sure.
I get it. Props. Yeah, okay. Yeah, I didn't
Yeah, yeah.
mean, you know.
Or I feel you even.
Yeah, yeah,
Young people might say that, and that's a
yeah,
very powerful thing, because
yeah,
it's not just I hear you.
yeah,
It's there's some emotion there that we might overlook and just think it's street speak or something,
yeah,
but to actually feel someone, we don't do very often as
yeah.
adults often, or
And they'll
professionals.
say it non-verbally.
Yeah,
The looks, you
yeah.
know, head nods. So there's ways of communicating that sometimes we underplay in terms of their power and what's really being said.
For sure. Last question, Rick, because I've detained you long enough from your mid-morning walk and the snow and the birds and the ducks.
Yeah.
Can you tell me, what area of public policy would you most like to see change in Canada?
Wow. Well, I think what needs the most attention would be the voice, particularly of those who've experienced sexual assault and crimes.
Okay.
I think that, you know, needs to be given more weight and understanding across the board, um, because as we see, particularly for murdered and missing Indigenous women, um, that, that those voices and those bodies have been ignored. But it's not just for that group. I think it's, you know, anybody who's experienced and been a victim of sexual assault and crimes, the way in which it is managed through the systems we have at play now are not restorative and don't honor those voices. So that's just picking one. There's more though. But,
Okay.
yeah.
And so what do you think would help them? Is it kind of that the system needs to be quite rejigged in order to make that possible? Or would you just like to see a public consultation or something on how it can be more victim centered or
Right.
victim supporting?
Yeah, I'd probably need to spend time on my second thoughts, because I think that would be a design issue. But I think in whatever way to once again center those voices and to build actually from that. Part of the problem is using what exists may not take us to address what are the needs. So I think I would start from what are the narratives in those experiences that are highlighting where they've been silenced and erased. Then how do we build around that? So I think, you know, a number of people are calling for reimagining how legal processes happen, and some of those people are actually, you know, legal scholars in that. So I would turn to them and their thoughts.
Okay. Well, Rick Kelly, thank you so much for joining me today. I've really enjoyed our conversation, and you know, I'm going to be doing more reading now on this myself, I think, because it's very in line with my own interests. And you've been involved in tremendous work and will continue to be, no doubt. So thank you for joining me on How to Talk Policy and Influence People, Rick. It's been a great pleasure.
It's been mine as well. It's been a wonderful conversation.
Super.
Okay.
Take care, Rick.
Okay. Take care.